Sooner or later, you're going to come across a stuck motor. The question is, what do you do with the thing? So we're about to start working on a ram charger over here, and he says, you know, let's see if we can free this thing up before we actually pull it out and rip it apart. Because I've already got my daily over here. I'm pulling the motor out of this thing because we've got some rotted freeze plugs. And yeah, I got lazy when we stuck it in. I knew I should have put freeze plugs in it. I didn't, and they're leaking. So he says, you know, I've already got to pull one motor. I don't want to have to do two. Let me see if I can save this thing. So we did. We freed it up. So let me show you how I go about it. I've saved dozens of them like this. But first you got to know if it's a viable candidate to be saved. So, I mean, obviously the first thing, you know, pull a dipstick and check the oil. So on this engine here, we've got a crankcase full of oil. There's no trace of water or anything like that. Well, a little bit, but you know, just condensation. But for the most part, it's nice oil. So I knew right off the bat the motor wasn't filled with water. I don't have to worry about everything being rusted together on the bottom end. Then, of course, if you're going to be serious about this, pull the heads. Because if you're going to pull the motor and you got to take it apart to rebuild it anyway, you're going to have to pull the heads anyway. So if you pull them off now, you'll know whether or not you've got a viable candidate here. If you pop the heads and you see scaly rust on the cylinder walls, or you see a lot of oxidation on the pistons, you know, stop now, because you're not going to be able to save this thing. But in our case, all we found was some light surface rust on a couple of cylinders and just general fumage, right? So now how do you go about saving this thing? What do you do? What steps do you take to save it? So the first thing I do is soak it down with penetrating fluid. In this case I used PB Blaster. Probably doused it with a can of this. Over the last 2 or 3 days, I'd come by every day and just give each cylinder a squirt with PB and let it sit. So then, the next step is critical, okay? You want to shock the motor loose. And for that, I like to use a length of black iron pipe. You can't really use wood. Wood won't transfer the shock from the hammer blow to the piston and jar the rings loose. You don't want to use force. You want to use shocking, short, sharp blows. And you want to go to each cylinder and alternate from side to side. So basically, you're going something like this, right? And use pipe. Don't use a pinch bar or anything, because that'll stress the center of the piston. Use the pipe, put the pipe flush against the piston like that, and give it a couple of good hard blows like this. Then come to the other side. Do the same thing. And alternate between your cylinders. Where you can't get the pipe in, just give the cylinder a nice piston, a nice shot like that. Work your way back and forth. Take your time. Force will only break rings, but doing it this way, just shocking it back and forth, will loosen whatever is stuck. So here's the critical part, right? As you're going back and forth, you'll eventually start to see witness marks change. So on this engine, I was looking at this cylinder right here, and I saw, after I made probably six or seven runs through the engine, hitting it with the pipe, I started to see a space over here, which means that I had worked it free. The motor was no longer stuck. Now you take a breaker bar. Right here, breaker bar. Now you take a breaker bar, put it on the crank, and all you do now is just work the motor back and forth. Just force it one way, and then force it the other way. Slowly, right? Don't push any harder than necessary, just to take up the play, right? And well, I've already freed this engine up, so it's going a lot easier than it starts out. But basically, all you want to do is keep going back and forth until you find the engine wants to stop. When the engine wants to stop, give it just a little push, and then come back the other way. And go to where she wants to stop, give the motor a little push, and come back and forth. And before you know it, this thing will be rotating nice and free, which is where we're at with this engine. So looking things over, I'm fairly confident this thing is going to live. You know, one other thing too, when you're doing this, as you're rocking the motor back and forth, pay attention to the movement of each piston. Because if you've got a bad bearing in there, you know, because sometimes you'll free these things up. They originally seized because they spun a bearing or you know, something along those lines, problem in the bottom end. So when you're rocking the motor back and forth, pay attention to the movement, to the subtle movements of each piston. Make sure that as you're going back and forth, there's no play. There's even movement across the engine and you don't hear any clunking sounds. Very important. So, like I said, this thing, I'm fairly confident we're going to be all right. Going to have to clean it up some. I'm going to pull this spider off because we had a mouse get in here and build a nest, so there's going to be a lot of little crud, you know, here and there. But other than that, you know, it's a good motor. So that's it. I hope you got something out of that. I'll see you tomorrow.